I'm Dan Rockmore, Chair of the Department of Mathematics here at Dartmouth and also Director of the William H. Neukom Institute for Computational Science. And on behalf of the college and the Institute, as well as the Departments of Studio Art, Film and Media Studies, and the Hood Museum, it's my pleasure to be able to introduce my friend, cinematographer Harry Dawson, who will deliver the Neukom Institute's Spring Donoho Colloquium, The Digital Eye. The Donoho Colloquium is an ongoing series of public lectures aimed at increasing awareness of the many important and sometimes surprising places in which computational ideas are relevant. These lectures are made possible by a generous gift from David, Mickey, and Dan Donoho in honor of Dan's graduation as a member of the class of 2006. The Donoho Colloquium is an important piece of the Neukom Institute's broader mission, which is to create and support an environment for computationally thematic creative work and thought throughout the Dartmouth community. This is a mission that's inherently interdisciplinary, and it's in this context that I find tonight's event especially exciting. The academic year 2012-2013 is, in fact, the year of the arts at Dartmouth. And tonight's Donoho Colloquium is the third lecture in what has effectively been a series, or perhaps more appropriately named a triptych, illustrating some of the ways in which digital and computational technologies and advances have played a significant role in the ever-evolving landscape of the arts. The place of computation in the arts today, in both the artistic process and product, is just the most recent example of the ways in which technology and the scientific method have influenced the arts, and especially the visual arts. It's a story that goes back at least 40,000 years to that first person driven to engineer a material agile and durable enough to create a lasting, meaningful image on a cave wall. And while we may think of the science-art symbiosis as particular to our own time, it is in fact a story that's relived in almost every generation. Even 75 years ago, the philosopher, poet, and essayist, and you'll have to excuse my French because I don't speak French, Paul Valéry wrote, "We must expect great innovations to transform the entire technique of the arts, thereby affecting artistic invention itself, and perhaps even bringing about an amazing change in our very notion of art." The amazement that Valéry expresses here summarizes the kind of feeling that I experienced when some years ago I came upon Bill Viola's video piece, Quintet of Remembrance, at the New York Metropolitan Museum of Art. Quintet of Remembrance was the first video work ever purchased by the Met, and it's one of the four-part quintet series that includes the Quintet of Silence owned by Dartmouth and currently displayed outside in the VAC's Nearburg Gallery. Now, I happened upon the work actually totally by accident, but found myself transfixed by the 16-minute video portrait, which to my eye was a minimalist Italian Renaissance tableau vivant. I'm no art critic or art historian, but in this close, detailed, and dynamic investigation of real-time emotion and drama, I saw a work of art that seamlessly integrated past, present, and future in its conception and especially in its execution. A breathtaking projection is what it was called in the words of William S. Lieberman, then chairman of the Met's Department of Modern Art. I returned to it over and over again that day. So you can imagine my delight when several years later, while working on a mathematics video project for the Annenberg Foundation, that I discovered that the director of photography with whom I'd become friendly was in fact the person responsible for shooting this extraordinary work of art. And I remember when I learned this, and I didn't learn it from Harry, and I ran up to Harry and I said, "You're my hero. You've made one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen." And what I've learned over the course of our own collaborations is that, as you may have guessed from that piece and others, that Harry is a real Renaissance man, part artist, part scientist, and part technologist, and absolutely all perfectionist. Harry has been shooting and editing film and video for more than 30 years, and his work has been favorably reviewed in the LA Times, American Cinematographer, the New Yorker, and the London Times. His broadcast credits include shooting for the PBS series Nova, Frontline and Nature, and his feature film experience includes camera work on the box office hit Twilight and a director of photography credit for the festival award-winning CORSO, The Last Beat. Harry has been the director of photography for Bill Viola's major pieces for more than 15 years, and these groundbreaking artworks have been featured in the National Portrait Gallery in London, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, MoMA, and the Guggenheim Museums in New York, Bilbao, and Berlin. To give you just one of the many notices this work has received, the LA Times wrote that Harry's work on the Tristan project, the video accompaniment to the recent Peter Sellers staging of Wagner's Tristan and Isolde, was, quote, quite simply the great Los Angeles artwork of our time. Harry's cinematography is featured in permanent installations at the Getty and other cultural and art institutions across the U.S. So please join me in welcoming our 2013 Spring Donoho Colloquium speaker, Harry Dawson.
Hello. I'm trying to get the lights off. They didn't want me to turn all the lights off, but it contaminates the screen and wrecks the images, so I insisted. So anyway, thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone. I'm very happy to be here and honored that I was asked to present in such an august forum. Before I spend a lot of time talking, I thought I would start off with some images. Isolde's Ascension is an excerpt from the 3.5-hour film created as the backdrop for Tristan and Isolde presented at the Paris Opera in 2006. The performer Sarah came to us from Cirque du Soleil, and her artistry was combined with a carefully planned lighting and shooting as she plunged into a specially created pool environment and sunk gracefully to the bottom in a single unedited shot. And a little sidebar here, all of the work I'm going to talk about today has been created in and by the camera with minimal or no manipulation in post-production. While this is not typical today, my own personal view is that reality has a feel to it that computer-generated images do not. Isolde's Ascension was shot on 35mm film using an Arriflex 435 in an underwater housing with a remote head. After the shooting was complete, the film was converted to HD video to go into editing. There it was slowed down a bit more and rotated 180 degrees, making her appear to float upwards instead of down. This manipulation was accomplished with computational mathematics. Right, Dan? I'm not a professor who is comfortable speaking in front of an audience. I'm not a scientist, and I don't call myself an artist either, but Dan Rockmore says it is so. And I have tremendous respect for my friend Dan, so I'll go with him on this. My personal interest as a cinematographer was and still is going around looking at things, seeing the most I can of the world, and along the way capturing a bit of the human spirit. Here's an example of that.
But for 2 days every year, the Shrums stop worrying about the forces of nature and focus on another kind of force. For a shot at the title, a Derby combine's got to move quickly and be able to take a pounding. But it has to deliver a good beating too, usually with the header, the business part of the combine. In the field, its function is to harvest the wheat. But in the Derby, its function is, yeah, that. So Team Shrum worked hard to prevent the header from absorbing the full, brutal whack.
Taking the blunt force on the header end and transferring that force through the machine, through all the main framework.
Hold it. Transferring force? How did you do that?
We took the tubing and ran it from the main shafts all the way through, clear up past where we've seen the failure points on these style of machines in the past.
Ah, okay, go. So the Shrum's header, like the rest of their machine, can take a pretty good beating. But the pit crew still faces big challenges between heats.
The boys sit there and watch Julie out in the ring. They're assessing the whole time. What's the combine sound like? What's it doing? Oop, that got broke. Okay, put that on the list.
It's really kind of a science because, you know, here's a machine that comes in with a bent frame, and you're thinking, how are we going to get that straightened back up?
Derby can be about the survival of the fittest machine, but it's also an attitude of your driver.
Your heart races, you get an adrenaline rush, you get the shakes, and then you go out and hit somebody, and then it kind of relaxes, but you still realize, like, I could really get hurt doing this.
This was an excerpt from a project I recently completed with Dan Rockmore and Marcelo Gleiser. The series features science, technology, engineering, and math in everyday life. Not everybody's everyday life, obviously. Tonight, I'd like to look at how the tools of moving picture creation have changed over time. My first premise is that artists are always trying to express what they see, and they will use any technology that is available to do that. Keeping abreast of fluid technologies is challenging. Today's digital cinema cameras are essentially specialized computers with a lens port on the front and a sensor inside. Yet no matter what technologies are used, the images that work on the emotional level have always had many things in common. The camera here is a 16 millimeter camera, Aeroflex SR2, as you can see. At this point in time, post-production was already taking place on a nonlinear computer-based editing system with computational mathematics. Here is a more recent generation film camera. Well, not exactly. It's an Aeroflex 435, which is a little bit newer, and a very heavy one to shoot handheld, I can tell you that. As I considered the title of this talk over the past few months, I realized that moving image in this context has a double meaning. The images themselves move, and the people watching those images are moved as they view them. Today, I will explore several ideas associated with both of those meanings of moving images and talk about how the drive to create images has influenced and been influenced by the available technologies. Here's one notion of that put into practice in the pre-digital age. This is a camera obscura used for recording images as true to life as technology could allow at the dawn of the 19th century. The image came through the front, and the user traced it onto a piece of paper at the back. Interestingly, the image came through the front and was upside down when it got to the back. Physics performs that magic by letting in the light through a pinhole in the front of the box. I'm sure Dartmouth's own Marcelo Gleiser could explain this phenomenon beautifully. Sadly, I cannot. The technology of pinhole camera has been updated a bit in the last 200 years, and while the goal is still the same, here is what it looks like in one of today's latest incarnations. Among other improvements, this is a machine which can capture the image for you. No pencil needed. Where the pinhole camera reflected an image onto a piece of tracing paper, the Sony F65 forms the image through a lens on the front and onto a sensor behind the lens, where electrical impulses are turned into digital information and recorded onto a hard drive. As a side note, at this point, the images are still upside down. I'm showing you this because it looks interesting and it's from the F-65 brochure, not because I can explain it much further, but maybe someone here can. But I'm getting ahead of things. I'd actually like to start by looking at the beginnings of image creation using technology. A year ago, I had the opportunity to personally experience some cave paintings in southern Spain, and while the images were static, the dynamic feeling of each one was deeply moving to me as a viewer. Archaeologists believe that somewhere around 20,000 years ago, or 40, a human lay next to a fire with a piece of charcoal recording images of a horse that I was able to look at millennia later. Whether this image was created for entertainment or for spiritual connection with the beasts and preparing for a hunt is unknown. But what is known is that this person was using the best available technology, a piece of charcoal, in a purposeful way to express a human idea in an aesthetic that was meaningful to her or his culture. Anyone at that time had access to the charcoal. It was a very democratized medium, but there were probably only a handful of artists who could make a recognizable image of an animal with such few expressive strokes of charcoal. This is a striking demonstration of an important concept that resonates today in digital technologies. Having access to technology doesn't mean you will automatically create art, and of course having an artistic aesthetic does not automatically imbue you with the ability to use the technology well. But it is also a clear reminder that those two things do intersect. The resulting work can be powerful even 20,000 years later. Moving ahead several thousand years and eastward a few thousand miles, this is the Scrovegni Chapel in Padua. It was painted by Giotto at the turn of the 14th century. I see these works as one of the significant steps in the evolution of moving images. The chapel contains 3 tiers of frescoes, each with 4 2-meter square scenes that, when viewed in order, depict the life of the Virgin Mary. The panels are well known for their emotional intensity as they trace the birth, death, and resurrection of Christ and the eventual last judgment day of man. Viewing these works may have been very much like a cinematic experience for the people of that time and place. And clearly, Giotto had many of the same talents and vision as a director of today's epic films. The images tell a narrative story, and when the viewer moves through them, instead of the images moving in front of the viewer. Giotto's technology was the giornata, which is painting on one section of newly applied wet fresco plaster over the course of a day before it dried. A very complicated process. So the fresco painter had to work very closely with the plasterers and to be very skilled as both a technician and an artist. An artist I work with in LA is Bill Viola, and he's quite well known for worldwide for bringing what is called video art into fine art contexts. I've been a cinematographer over 20 years. Dan's intro was written some time ago, but it's still valid, mostly. In a piece called Going Forth by Day, we paid homage to Giotto and the Scrovegni Chapel. This piece was commissioned by the Guggenheim in Berlin in 2002, and it was a reflection on death and its aftermath. As in this chapel, Going Forth by Day was a room full of images that viewers walked into and surrounded on 4 sides by moving narrative images. Quoting from the Guggenheim's website, "To enter the space, viewers literally step into the projected light of the first image. Once inside, they stand at the center of an image-sound world with projections on every wall. The story told by each panel is embedded within the larger narrative cycle of the room. Viewers are free to move around the space and watch each panel individually or to stand back and experience the piece as a whole. The 5 image sequences are approximately 35 minutes in length and play simultaneously on continuous loops. Sound from each panel mixes freely with the space, creating an overall acoustic ambience." End quote. The images are projected directly onto the walls without screens or framed supports, as in Italian Renaissance frescoes, where the paint was applied directly onto the wet plaster surface of the walls. A fairly complicated combination of equipment allowed us to create a room that evoked Giotto, but in which it would be virtually impossible to see the art in the same way twice. As in Giotto's time, the technical process was extremely complicated, and the interplay between craftspeople and artists was critical to the end successes. The same way Giotto had to know how the plaster would change in texture over the course of a day. Before we began shooting, we needed to plan for the final projection and how it would affect the imagery. This is a detail of one of the frescoes from the Scrivener Chapel. I'm sorry, it's not a very high-resolution image, so it's a little pixelated. Maybe you can see it better in the back, I don't know. It's called The Last Judgment. It depicts some fairly disastrous endings for a lot of people who were spending their earthly years focused on daily life rather than preparing for the afterlife. These works compressed images into a short depth of field. This fresco provided an inspiration for the Deluge, one piece of Going Forth by Day installation in Berlin. The Deluge was straight ahead as the viewers entered the room. The image was cropped to a square frame. The lens setting was on the longer end of a zoom. There were no primes for these cameras at that time, so the image feels a bit flattened. This was shot on high-definition video. I positioned the facade of the building so that it would always be in the shadow of the sun, so I could create a midday feeling with the light. The set was built outside over a 30,000-gallon specially constructed pool. Another fresco from the Scrivener Chapel is the Birth of the Virgin. Giotto was what you might call an early adopter of the newly rediscovered forced perspective, making something two-dimensional appear three-dimensional. At the beginning of the 14th century, it appears Giotto may not have had his vanishing point math down pat, but he had a pretty close natural eye for that kind of thing. If you look at the roofs and the porch and the outside walls of the building, you can see that there is a mixed perspective in this painting, which we wanted to purposefully emulate in another piece, Going Forth by Day. This panel served as an inspiration for the voyage. This is the sketch I got from Bill as we began work on the piece. You can clearly see Giotto's house featured in the foreground, and Bill's vision added a lake in the background. Mixing the perspectives as well as the depth of field was intentional to give the piece a sense of unease for our modern eyes. This is an excerpt from The Voyage. You'll notice it uses mixed perspective similar to Giotto's work. Inside the house, an old man lies ill on a bed, attended by his son and daughter-in-law. Down on the shore, a boat is slowly being loaded with possessions from the dying man's home. The man's wife, who passed away some time before, waits patiently nearby the boat. Several minutes into the piece, the son and daughter-in-law depart, leaving the old man alone with his dreams and fading breath. His house, container of lives and memories, is closed and locked. Soon after, the old man reappears on the shore and is greeted by his wife, who has been waiting for his arrival. They board the boat that is to carry them to the Isles of the Blessed. In the time of Giotto, painters frequently put the main characters in different parts of the scene at the same time. When the piece was premiered in Berlin, I saw German viewers gesturing at it, and seemingly they were pointing out the mismatched perspective angles They can't get in. Digital technology allowed us to present something in the voyage that was impossible in nature, yet somewhat common in Giotto's work. After a many-day scout of Southern California trying to find the proper location, I finally found a lakeshore I knew would work. I could immediately see that the shot was there if we could levitate 30 feet in the air and be at the right at the edge of the water. We went through a long and fairly complicated production period, which included mounting the camera on a 30-foot platform to get the proper angle. You'll notice that the boat is at the bottom of the frame and the lake is way out beyond it, so you can realize to get all this in the same frame, the angle of view on the lens needed to be very wide. For the shot to work the way I wanted, the sun on this day in October needed to be as low as possible before dipping behind the hills. We needed a single continuous take that ran for the same 35 minutes as the other pieces in the exhibition. After a week of shooting, we barely made it on the last day before the boat got stuck in the mud again. Driver was a crazy man. To add the house and the hill to the image, I've realized why this one is so messed up is that it's a scan from a book. And I didn't have the original too, but maybe you can see what's going on anyway. To add the house and the hill to the image, we used green screen technology. This is one of the few times we've ever done that amount of post-production manipulation. This allowed us to mix the two images with different perspectives. The house was built on a stage and shot from a high angle in the back of the stage with a telephoto lens. And now I turn to my second question of the evening. Is technology in the service of art, or has art forced changes in technology? In my field, this question is correlated to the ongoing issues around the use of film stock versus the use of digital cameras. I would argue that the development of art and technology has always been a two-way street, and still is. As we've seen tonight, whether it has been charcoal or fresco or film, artists' work are shaped by the technologies available. And when they don't have what are needed, they figure out a way to make new clay or develop a new pigment. One contemporary example of artistic need-driving technology is the Red One camera. It was announced in 2006 and pre-sold more than 3,000 units before the first one was delivered almost 18 months later. Was there such a pent-up need for a high-resolution digital cinema camera which could use standard motion picture lenses and eliminate the high cost of film that people were willing to pay sight unseen to get their hands on the technology? Or was it brilliant marketing? Well, everyone has to agree it was brilliant marketing in any case. Even though the Red could not fully compete with the quality of the filming image, it turned out to be a watershed technology on several fronts, and it opened the floodgates to what has been an ongoing race to the Holy Grail, a digital camera that looks as good as or even better than film. Some of the newest cameras have such resolution that the images appear hyper-real, and yet, to me, there is a reason that films such as the 2012 release Lincoln are still shot on film. Film has an emotive quality which, at least so far, digital cinema cameras can't quite emulate, in my opinion, though the Arri Alexa comes close. And this piece, called The Ancestors, was shot on the Sony F65. As of 2012, was the latest and greatest, largest censored digital motion picture production camera. Using the latest and greatest is always a challenge, and with the releases of new hardware coming so quickly, I've often found myself in what has been the beta test. Ancestors was part of a project that took us to the Mojave Desert many times over a period of several months, finding the correct angles and distances and lenses and cameras that would accomplish what we needed. You'll remember none of this is digital. This is all real. It's a real sandstorm, not one we created, though we did have Ritter fans there to do that if we wanted, but it happened all on its own. This is a silent piece. This one actually was not demexed, so it's the actual image, and it looks out of focus, but that's only because of the distortion of the heat and the sand. The woman, Sharon, is from Africa, and when I told her it was going to be really hot out there, she says, "I'm from Africa. The hotter the better." I love it. This also was in the Mojave Desert. I guess I already said that, but it looked a lot like Africa to me, though I've never been to that part of Africa. The camera was turned on its side and shot vertically like this. So this is the first image tonight that has been digital all the way through, from capture through post. Except for the combines. That was too, actually. Like many of Bill's pieces, I feel like this one is one where it presents more questions than it answers. Bring your own narrative is what I call it. So that's been a single take with no cuts and 2 sandstorms. These 2 red epics proved not to be the solution in this instance for the Mojave. The F-65 was. You will notice the huge air conditioning apparatus. Reds are known to stop running in heat, just as people do, so we were attempting to head off that problem for the camera at least. The unedited single takes that are emblematic of Bill Viola's works are often longer than a roll of film. And to complicate that, we often want the final piece to appear in super slow motion. Digital recording media gives us a longer runtime than a roll of film can. Unfortunately, high-speed digital data rates can't transfer data fast enough for a long enough period of time. We'd like it to go at 1,000 frames per second for 20 minutes and a continuous take at 2K resolution or better. We shot this piece on the F-65 at the highest frame rate we could, which was 60 frames a second. I also believe in using all the technologies available, giving myself the widest possible palette. Here's an example of that. The body of work that includes The Visitation was created for the 2009 Venice Biennale. The black and white parts were shot on a 1970s vintage video surveillance camera, the kind that were originally in parking garages and stairwells and recorded onto videotape stock. Color portions were shot on a Sony 950 high-definition camera, the best of its day. Both cameras rolled simultaneously. The images were mated in the editing room, where we were able to dissolve between them, again employing sophisticated computational mathematics invisibly inside the machinery. The special effects are all live, though not necessarily low-tech. The shimmering image is hundreds of gallons of water dropping off a razor-thin edge, making a transparent wall. The sound in the studio was deafening. Making the dissolve work was complicated because the camera's images were geometrically dissimilar. The digital camera was shooting a 16:9 native image, and the other camera was gathering light through a non-standard size Plumicon pickup tube and recording it onto tape. Almost like trying to use a DOS program in the Mountain Lion operating system. And it's kind of funny, the Microsoft spell checkers had no idea what a Plumicon tube was. Probably you guys don't either, but it's from the early days of video that us old guys would know about, like Jim. This work was created for the chapel in the square of San Gallo in Venice, and there was 3 different size altar. They were like altarpieces in this decommissioned chapel. And so people would come from the distance in the fuzzy background dead world into the foreground and take a look at who was watching them and then go back again. It was when I first walked in to see it, there was people leaving in tears, and I thought, well, maybe this isn't a good idea. To make the cameras work together, we built this rig in James Cameron's 3D shop. The rig allowed us to line up both cameras with some modifications to machinery and software. This is the rig and tank. The whole camera rig was mounted on a computer-assisted motion control device so that the camera could track back with the performers as they approached the wall. I have to admit that after working with it for over a week, I finally had to try it myself. So my daughter and I went through one take. It's amazing to me that the wall of water is so flat that you can see Erica's reflection almost perfectly. While they did make this into a piece, this is just a snapshot from the side. Otherwise, you couldn't see those reflections like that. And they didn't turn me into a ghost, thankfully. Before moving pictures, artists were limited to working with 2 or 3 dimensions. The cinematographer's toolkit allows us to work in 4 dimensions, X, Y, Z, and time. Digital cameras have added to that toolkit and allowed us to play with time in even more ways. Sometimes the toolkit also includes baby piggies, but that's a different story. So, technology has changed the process, but not the aesthetic in moving image creation. The upcoming generations of digital natives are finding digital cameras almost as easy to manipulate as that piece of Neolithic charcoal. Today's digital cinema cameras are democratizing filmmaking. It's cheaper and faster to shoot in bits than on film. But no matter what tools the cinematographer takes from his kit, it still comes down to the aesthetic. So that's it. Any questions? Yes.
Thank you. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the collaborative relationship between the artist and yourself or whoever, the group, the team that's working together, and to what extent everybody, what different people.
Well, there's Bill who makes the sketches that you saw one of, and Kira is the executive producer. He's his wife. She's his wife. And then there's a producer. For a while it's been Genevieve Anderson. And we bring in other people, set designers, production designers, and effects people as necessary for each particular project. And I've been with him longer than anyone. And he usually gives me a drawing and then a photograph out of a book that's a picture from the Renaissance or some other art history thing that he really likes and wants to emulate, or he has some feeling about that he wants to put in his own pieces.
Do you storyboard everything very specifically and exactly how, or do you have any element of accident that comes into the process between the technology and the planning?
She wants to know if there's any element of accident in between the planning and the technology. Well, when things are of this scale and this big, we try to not have accidents, but what it is I take the image that he's showing me, the drawing, the sketch, and the picture, and ask him over and over and over and over again to draw the sketch again, and then the things that stay the same in the sketch are the things that I know are important to him. So we try to get this set done and the technology done and location figured out and all this stuff so that when Bill appears on the set, everything's ready to go and he can direct the actors. So it depends on which piece it is. The one where was on the lake, we scouted for weeks, Bill and I, trying to find the right place. And he didn't see where it could be done there, and I did, because I don't know, I can just see up in the air somehow. So once we got there and we knew what was happening, we were okay. Did that answer your question at all?
I mean, do you have any example of any work that you've done where it's not planned meticulously and it's carried out meticulously, but something came in that changed it?
Well, it's always planned meticulously, and then when we get there, we allow things to happen within that framework. That's the best way to put it.
Through the actors? Or
Yeah, with the actors, and if we're outside with the lighting, like the sandstorm, or the lighting on the at the lake, it turned out that the perfect light, as you saw the shadows on the shoreline, I figured it had to be done like that. So we waited all week, we did these takes at that time of day, and the freaking boat kept getting stuck, and so we'd have to wait till the next day. And then we had that, and we took that image, that piece of video into the studio, and they built the house and the hill and lit it, so it felt like it was in there, in the space, and then worked with the actors and so forth, within the context of what we'd already shot. One example. Yeah, Jim?
How many takes on this picture?
He was always asking me how many takes we did. I couldn't remember.
I was curious where, if you talked about doing 3D on any of this future project, perhaps, and how that might work.
We have, and I've avoided it so far. It's a technical nightmare, I was going to say, I will say, for me. To do it on the highest level is, there's so many restrictions with what you can do technologically. But we'll probably get there someday soon, but I haven't done it yet. I know about it. I keep my eye on it. Yes?
So you made reference to the emotive quality of film,
Mm-hmm.
and I wonder if, in 100 years, obviously there's a lot of development in technology to try to have digital capabilities surpass that of film. What do you think would be something that would be missed? Is there something within film, this emotive quality perhaps, that can never be captured in digital?
She's asking about, eventually in 100 years, will digital be as good as film? Essentially is what you asked.
Or what would be, is there something that digital may never capture that film does?
Those are questions that people ask every day on forums, and the answer is probably digital stuff will be equal or different or better or for different reasons. So at this point in time, when film is used rarely anymore, mostly digital now for movies and TV, that we still have an example of film. These pieces here were shot in film, and they just have this fluid quality to them. More three-dimensional is what I call it. But digital is very, very good, but sometimes it's too sharp. In fact, people that use digital cinema cameras now try and go and find old lenses that have flaws in them to put on the new cameras to make it look a little bit more, have some more guts to it or something, more texture, because they're too clean. So yes, that'll be worked on and changed, and perhaps, you'll be able to tweak things with the sensor or with the capture or something to put a little bit more grain in it. People have talked about being able to do that. But digital grain is so even that it doesn't have that same quality as that old black and white camera, which was something that was mostly infrared, and you starve it for light and move, and it gives a trailing ghost effect. So those kinds of things can't be done in After Effects or with digital imagery or anything. So, but eventually, of course, there'll be things that will feel as good as that, I assume, after I'm gone, maybe. Yeah, thank you.
Harry, thanks so much.